Okay, I think we've got just about everyone here. Welcome. Thanks for joining. This is the SCT final work presentation for semester 2, spring of 2020. I know many of you have attended this event before hosted normally in the Kappa Symposium, but I'm glad that we could make it here work at least in some fashion. And while this Zoom presentation is a little bit different than we're used to for some of these SCT advanced work presentations, this still represents the culmination of a lot of hard work. Some of these are one-term advanced work projects, but most of them are two-term projects. And the thing that's really striking about them is most of them are, in fact, the culmination of much more than 2 terms of work. This is really the advanced work at the heart of everyone's plans, and is a nice look at some of the fascinating creative approaches that our students here at Bennington take. And I'm particularly impressed with the work that this group has done despite some of the challenges of the semester. They've all written very unique, thoughtful pieces that really highlight some of the interdisciplinary ways of learning that we have here at Bennington. And I've really enjoyed working with all of them and reading some of which are quite long pieces of work, as you'll hear more about. We also will have a celebration, a toast to these seniors with SCT faculty, all of them at the library gathering next Wednesday. So we look forward to that. And just as a quick reminder, a few students asked that this be recorded, so I am recording. And again, this is not so much a formal presentation as a chance just for everybody to share their work and let you all know as friends, family, colleagues, some of the work that they have been working on for so long. So we'll start with Kim, unless anybody has any other things to add early on. Great. Kim, take it away.
Oh, thank you, because it's saying that you muted me, which is great. So give me a second so I can share my screen with everyone. Noah, do you mind because it's saying like you disable attendee screen sharing? Yeah, I'm able to share now, so that's great. Thank you. Okay. Just gonna do. Everybody can hear me? Good. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is Kim, and today I am presenting my senior thesis, Behind the Mask of Tough Love, Investigating Toxic Shaming in Vietnamese Parenting. This thesis addresses the topic of toxic shaming in Vietnamese parenting, where and how to draw the line between healthy and toxic shaming and the impacts of toxic shaming on child development and the child-parent bond in the Vietnamese context. So shaming is a disciplinary process through which parents express their disapproval of children's transgression when children fail to conform to societal standards or to perform as parents expect. However, shaming can become maladaptive and toxic if parents perform it for their own benefit, not their children's. In this way, toxic shaming sends out a message to children that parents' approval equals worthiness, causing children self-attack and denial behaviors, and also their disconnection with their parents. So you may ask, why was I interested in this topic? This topic is very close to my heart. Born and raised in Hanoi, Vietnam, and being surrounded by toxic shaming, it has been part of my life growing up. While studying abroad in the US, my distance from my own culture allowed me to identify and acknowledge toxic shaming as a cultural phenomenon and a public health concern rather than a personal matter. However, the fact that toxic shaming is not recognized as a cultural issue and a lack of social and legislative intervention from the state frustrated me. Thus, I decided to do this research on such an inadequately discussed topic in hopes of raising cultural awareness among Vietnamese and also calling for appropriate institutional responses. My main hypothesis is that toxic shaming is a common and harmful but insufficiently addressed disciplinary measure among Vietnamese parents. With this in mind, in January of 2020, I traveled back to Hanoi, Vietnam, and conducted this research in my own community. Here, I interviewed 10 participants, 4 of whom were parents themselves, and they were interviewed about the experiences with toxic shaming. All the findings were so fascinating. All 10 participants in the research reported to have been exposed to toxic shaming either in their personal experience or as public witness. Moreover, cultural pressure, the fear of losing face in particular, was observed to be the culprit behind toxic shaming. The fear of being shamed in front of others because of children's misconduct scared parents and motivate parents to adopt shaming in order to protect themselves. Parents also practice shaming to relieve certain social pressures, such as workplace stress. And in addition, participants revealed to have experienced low self-esteem, perfectionism, self-doubt, a sense of worthlessness, and engaging in self-sabotage behaviors, such as drinking and gambling, in order to get rid of this sense of inferiority and also find pleasure. I also found that while participants who didn't have children were optimistic that they would not practice shaming in the future, participants who were parents said that although they tried not to use shaming, they ended up using shaming and it turned into toxic shaming very easily. However, all participants agree that toxic shaming is not the answer and there is a pressing need for solutions regarding toxic shaming in Vietnamese parenting. So these findings support the need for national and also local prevention programs, psychological and emotional support for both parents and children, and a humanistic mechanism for reporting child abuse and providing intervention. Toxic shaming is masked as tough love, but it is not love. Parents lie to children and themselves that this practice is done out of love, despite its function of manipulating children to please their parents. Only when parents practice parenting from commitment, respect, trust, responsibility, that they know how to love and become capable of loving. One of the participants in my group at the end of the interview told me, I'm not worthy of my children's love if I cannot give them love myself. And this made me to conclude that love is not terror and definitely not toxic shaming. I just really want to acknowledge some of the help along the way that has been very meaningful to me. I would like to express my gratitude to my thesis advisor, Noah Coburn, my second reader, David Andrek, my former Debbie Warnock, my second reader, Debbie Warnock, for all of their constructive criticism, encouragement, and also kindness. And I would also like to express my gratitude to Susan Scorbetti, Nora Russo Cabrelli, my proofreaders, Carolyn Haft, Ethan Mueller, and Claire Webb, my senior thesis classmates, my family, and also my dearest friends for the profound belief in my abilities and emotional and also moral support during this very difficult time. And thank you for coming to my presentation and listening to it.
Thanks, Kim. That was great. Next up, we have Allie Morgan.
Hi guys, my name is Allie if you don't know me. And my research over the past year has been aimed at investigating complicated grief and its connection to life story style. So complicated grief is an abnormal prolonging of grief paired with an inability to accept death, suicidal ideation, and approximately 20% of grievers experience this type of grieving. The thing that I compared complicated grief to was life narrative styles, and they're essentially different forms of finding meaning in our experiences. And they come in two basic forms: contamination sequences and redemption sequences. So in a contamination sequence, an individual tells a story of an affectively negative situation, but is able to transform it into a positive situation. And alternatively, a contamination sequence is when a storyteller takes an affectively positive story and turns it into a negative outcome. So ultimately, I discovered that individuals with complicated grief tend to tell more contaminated life stories. And I think this is because these individuals' perceptions of their lives have been corrupted at their core by personal loss. And the loss, it has intrinsically altered the way that they narrate their memories, what memories they recall, how they feel about them, and the meaning they take from them. So over the course of 2 months, 8 participants completed a grief assessment and an interview. And half of these participants were complicated grievers and the other half were adaptive grievers. The grief assessment I used was called the Inventory of Complicated Grief, and it is a diagnostic tool that includes 4 criteria that must be met in order to justify a diagnosis of complicated grief, and it includes 12 different items. After the assessment, each participant was interviewed in a life story interview format, and their interviews were coded for redemption and contamination sequences and then analyzed for other reoccurring themes. So my basic findings were that the participants with complicated grief told more contamination than redemption sequences, and the participants without contaminated grief told more redemption sequences than contamination sequences. I also found that individuals with complicated grief were more likely to use avoidance as a coping mechanism. And I also saw a big impact of something called meaning making in overcoming grief. So individuals with more adaptive grief processes were not only able to find positive outcomes in negative life situations, such as the death itself, but they were also able to reevaluate their relationships with their lost loved ones in order to continue a bond with that person without unhealthy yearning. So for people with complicated grief, they have an inflexibility that interrupts the assimilation of the loss into the life story. They have less capacity to find benefit in negativity, and they have problems with healthy continued bond with the lost loved one. So just to conclude, narrative psychology tells us that the reconstruction of a world of meaning is the central process in grieving. And there's a type of therapy called narrative reconstruction therapy, where clinicians can help clients reconstruct their problematic self-narratives, including the stories of loss, and incorporate more positive and flexible meanings into their loss. So my treatment recommendation for individuals with complicated grief is that grief therapy should incorporate strategies from narrative reconstruction therapy in order to reconstruct contaminated memories, find benefit in adversity, and help individuals lessen contamination surrounding the death of their loved one. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Allie. Next up, we have Eve.
All right. So let's pull up my slides. So, as most of you know, my thesis is called Root Shock, the impact of gentrification on educational outcomes in Los Angeles. Share my screen. Okay. Naturally, this wouldn't load. All right, can everyone see it? Can one person? Okay. To give you some background on defining gentrification as a spatial process in which higher income populations invade, to use the colonial metaphor, low income neighborhoods, changing the social character of the space, increasing property values, and displacing incumbent residents. And in this paper, I look specifically at the educational context, what Wing calls the final frontier of gentrification. So I'm asking, do those increased property values increase school funding, or does gentrification reproduce segregation and inequality? And I'm arguing the latter. I have qualitative and quantitative analyses in this thesis. My qualitative analyses come from 12 semi-structured interviews with young women living in Los Angeles, many of them in or near gentrifying areas. And I'm not going to go in depth into all of the themes. We don't have the time. But in my paper, I discuss the salience of gentrification and predictors of gentrification discourse for the young women. Then I go into the impacts of gentrification on the young women's lives in general. These took 2 to 3 major forms: financial and housing instability. Most of the young women had to move or experience severe rent pressure as rents increased in gentrifying areas. Most of the young women had moved at least once because of increased rent or cost of living. And this, of course, impacted their ability to focus on school. A lot of them had quite intense family stress caused by this financial hardship. The young women also described feeling unsafe, usually in their new neighborhoods, if they had to move to an area with a lower cost of living. This was particularly important in my sample, as they were all young women. So a number of the women experienced a loss of opportunity because having moved, they had greater distances to travel to get to opportunities, taking often public transit, and they and their families had to make really difficult decisions about what was safe and what wasn't. So that limited their opportunities. Then I turned to the impact of gentrification on the geography of schools in particular, and I discussed college preparation and where students access that within the school, in external programs that are free or paid programs. And I find largely the outsourcing of college preparation programs, which has serious implications for equity. My quantitative analysis uses the Los Angeles Index of Neighborhood Change and the California Department of Education data. And I asked, to what extent does gentrification impact ACT and SAT scores as mediated by race, class, and school type? I have a number of findings, and for time reasons, again, I won't go into it in depth, but I find my results support existing findings that a higher percentage of Black and Hispanic students is related to lower SAT and ACT scores at both kinds of schools, traditional, public, and charter. Then I look at the interaction effect between the race measures and gentrification and the free lunch measures and gentrification, finding that increasing percentages of Hispanic students at the school, increasing percentages of students eligible for free lunch is associated with a reduction in the benefits of gentrification. So in some cases, gentrification might actually be associated with increased scores, but Hispanic students and students on free lunch see less of those effects. I then separate by traditional, public, and charter, finding similar results to all schools at the traditional public level. At the charter level, I actually don't find that inverse relationship. I find a direct relationship between an increase in the percent of Black students and an increase in the experience benefits of gentrification. And that's only at charter schools, and I don't find significant effects for the other interaction effects. So this does, again, raise serious questions about accessibility of these opportunities, what populations know how to get into charter schools, know that they might be beneficial, have the time, money, all the resources that it takes to do that. So in conclusion, I find uneven distribution of educational opportunity and an outsourcing of college preparation programs, both of which are in the context of increased financial difficulty, loss of home and culture, and decreased feelings of safety, all of which are arising out of gentrification. So I'll stop there. These are my acknowledgements, and thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks, Eve. Next up is Lila.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, so my thesis explores the idea of authenticity in food by looking at Chinese restaurants in the East Village of New York City. In my work, I focus on 3 elements that contribute to the feeling of authenticity: ambiance of the restaurant, the taste of the food, and the individual customer experiences. Ultimately, I argue that authenticity cannot be defined by one element, and attempting to do so denies the fact that perceptions change. Experience, ambiance, and taste contribute to an individual understanding, but nailing it to one ignores all the other possibilities that authenticity can be. My favorite part of this process of my research was over fieldwork term, where I got to enjoy dishes from all the restaurants that I studied. So today I just want to show some of my favorite foods that I got to eat. So Ho Foods is a Taiwanese restaurant that specializes in beef noodle soup. But pictured here, I have the soft tofu. It's served cold, and it's a brick of homemade tofu that's drizzled in sweet soy sauce, topped with bonito flakes and a century egg with a sprinkle of scallions to garnish. The tofu itself is similar in texture to that of silken tofu from a grocery store, but it's gentler and smoother. The bonito flakes on top are made from dried fermented skipjack tuna. They're very salty and very fishy, and melt when they hit your tongue. The century egg, which is also called a 1,000-year-old egg, is a very acquired taste. Whole eggs are brined in sodium solution for 10 days and covered in clay to let ferment for about 2 weeks. The result is a white that is now a jelly-like translucent amber color, and the yolk's a very dark green. All these elements together make for a really salty experience and a powerful flavor. The soft, gentle tofu and the sweet soy make a perfect balance for the strong flavors of the egg and bonito. While the dish might not be for everyone considering this egg, I would still say it's an experience definitely worth trying. Little Tong Noodle Shop is a restaurant that specializes in mixian noodles, a traditional rice noodle from the Yunnan province in southwest China. The most popular dish here is the grandma chicken mixian. The noodles themselves are made of 100% rice and water that undergo a slight fermentation process in order to get a little sourness in the taste, as well as a nice bouncy spaghetti-like texture. The broth is made from both chicken and duck bones and steeps for over 24 hours before being served. It's topped with chicken thigh that's been cooked in its own fat, a homemade fermented chili paste, a black sesame and garlic oil, and a tea egg topped with cilantro and homemade seasonal pickles. The chili gives a nice spice without overwhelming the palate. The soup has a very gentle flavor, something reminiscent of chicken soup from when you were sick as a kid. Overall, the dish is an excellent textural experience between the springy noodles, the crunchy pickles, and the tender chicken. At Mala Projects, Szechuan dry pots are the main draw of the menu. The term mala refers to a type of spice. The la refers to a spice that is most commonly thought of in Chinese cuisine. the heat that hits you in the back of your throat and carries down while swallowing. The ma sensation is one of a numbing quality that is most commonly found in Szechuan peppercorns. This heat is one that's primarily felt in the front of the mouth and on the lips and is an experience that's very unique to this cuisine. The most intriguing dish on the menu was that simply called mala duck neck. There was no real smell coming from the duck, but when taking a bite, the flavor explodes in your mouth. The duck neck had clearly been marinated in some sort of 5-spice mixture with strong anise and cinnamon. The heat did not hit immediately, but after a few chomps at the bone, the feeling in your lips starts to dissipate and instead becomes almost a tingling pins and needle sensation similar to when a foot falls asleep. The heat is a welcome feeling that complements the ever-present 5-spice used to season without overpowering. Although it's difficult to get the meat off the bony neck, the taste is absolutely worth it. At Dion Kitchen, the majority of the menu consists of Mixian noodles, the same as Little Tongue Noodle Shop's specialty. All the entrees use these noodles as their base, with other small bites also from the region. The tofu rice noodle consists of the underlaying noodles, topped with a tofu pudding, lots of chives, homemade pickled vegetables, and garnished with peanuts. The noodles themselves were reminiscent of the ones served at Little Tongue, but these were noticeably softer and more tender. It seemed as if they were not fermented. The tofu pudding in the center really stood out as it had very intriguing mouthfeel. The consistency is most similar to that of silken tofu, but it's perhaps even softer in that it's so delicate that it reminds me more of a custard. In that way, the term pudding is very fitting. The pickled vegetables seemingly consisted of mostly mustard greens with a few smaller pieces that looked to be carrots. While not having a strong vegetal flavor, the funk of the pickle is very present in the dish itself without overwhelming the flavor of the sauce. On top of the tofu, there seemed to be a small amount of chili oil, but once mixed into the sauce, it did not have a strong impact on the heat level. There's, with the other toppings, a dollop of some sort of sauce, but it's not specified what it is. Visually, it's obviously very thick and dark. It had an overwhelming taste of salt, but when mixed together adds a really nice and necessary balance to the gentle tofu. Most likely it's a fermented black bean paste that becomes nice and saucy when mixed with the other elements. Overall, the dish proved to be both a textural and flavorful success. Those are all of the dishes I wanted to share today, but that was the most fun part of my thesis, and I really hope that you guys try these dishes if you're ever in New York.
Thanks, Lila. We should have made you go last because I'm now quite hungry. Next up is Yvonne.
Hello. So basically, I'm sure you guys know. So I did mine on subnational responses to the global freshwater crisis. I specifically did the case studies of California, Jalisco, and Mexico because I've lived in these two states. My family's from these two areas, and so I really wanted to dive into the issue of water because I don't know if you guys know, but 0.014% of all that water on Earth is fresh and accessible. And with this, the water is either contaminated or is being very depleted. And as a result of this water scarcity, disproportionately affecting different areas. So in the case of these two states, I decided to compare the idea of is subnational governments the most effective way to combat issues pertaining to water? And so I looked into the governments of these two states, specifically their governors, since in 2018, the California and Jalisco both appointed new governors. In the case of California, Gavin Newsom, and then in Jalisco, Enrique Alfaro Ramirez. And so basically these two governors they're more to the left of the political spectrum. And what's most notable about these two is as soon as they took office, they promoted the idea of improving the water quality within their states. And so basically for my methodology, I went to both areas. I selected the most contaminated areas within these two states. So in Jalisco, I went to El Salto, Juanacatlan, and San Pedro Itzacan. And then in California, I went to Dos Palos. And in there, I did interviews with local residents. I also did with water district personnel in California and a local politician in Jalisco. And so basically, my findings were very interesting from the literature and also in terms of the interviews. The literature says that subnational responses actually can promote better governments in terms of they're more closer to the local populations and issues in the local level can easily be remedied through, but it's only under favorable political and economic conditions. And so when I went to the areas, what I found was even though the governors said that they're going to do a lot of things in terms of cleanup programs, that they actually went to several of these areas and told the local population that they're going to fix them. But when I spoke to local residents, they told me the opposite. They told me, yes, even though they did say this, but we don't think it's going to happen. There's a lot of things that's going on, and a lot of things really haven't changed since they came here. And so basically what I've noticed was, even though the governors are saying they're going to do all these initiatives, the local populations within these two states are saying, they're basically showing pessimistic perceptions of governance. And so basically what I dive into is basically from these two perspectives, how can issues of water be remedied through subnational governments? And so, yeah, that was basically my my project.
Terrific, thanks. Next up is Angmo.
Yeah. Hi. So I wrote my thesis on stigmatization of menstruation and effects of migration on menstrual experiences of Ladakhi women in the US. So like I talk about how menstruation is stigmatized in my hometown and how religion, patriarchy, social structures, lack of education and awareness, religion, and economic factors all intertwined together leads to the stigma, and which really affects women's experience with menstruation and how it becomes a barrier rather than a natural part of their body. So the reason I chose menstruation for this project is because of my own personal experience with it. I always thought it as a barrier and a burden that a womankind must endure. But coming to the States have really helped me to embrace my body, especially menstruation. So I wanted to research more on that. That is why I decided to choose my own experience as a source for this study, along with the interviews that I conducted. So I'm gonna just go through like the different sections I have in my paper. So first I talk about patriarchy and the social structures of like gender and gender roles and everything. So women in Ladakh from a very young age are like expected to stay home and do all the household chores and not participate in any communal activities or events, or especially like leadership roles that are happening in the society, which can be visibly seen in the local government because there's only 2 women representatives. And they're restricted from not just participating in the social activities, but also going just out with your friends for just normal things, because young women are seen as trouble because of menstruation and the ability of women to get pregnant before marriage, which can bring shame to the family. So that is why they're restricted from going out at all times. And many of my informants in the study mentioned like struggling with that and having conflicts with their parents because of that. And coming to the States have really like allowed them the freedom and independence, and being free from the supervision of their parents in society has allowed them to like enjoy certain things as a women, including talking about menstruation openly with people around you. And then religion is another factor. In Buddhism, menstruation and childbirth is considered as one of the greatest sufferings. And in many monasteries, there are certain rooms where women of menstruating age are not allowed to enter, and in certain households women are asked to not do like regular household like regular prayers and stuff during menstruation. But most of my informants found this like beliefs really outdated, and they all sort of resisted against it by hiding their menstrual status from their families. And then education and awareness is another factor. So when I asked them about their first experience with menstruation, most of these women didn't know what was happening to them, how to use the products, who to go for help. And considering the lack of conversation between mothers and daughters, they couldn't even go to their mothers for help. And schools also fail to provide proper information to these women that leave them with like no source of information and a space for them to really talk about it. which really leads to like self-consciousness and like low self-esteem among women. But migrating to the US, they feel much more, they feel like they have much more access to knowledge and information on like menstruation in itself, but like also on different kind of products that are available and like what the products are made of and like the impacts of it on your health and environment and other things. So they feel like they are more in control of their body and what are they using and all that. And then lack of awareness, lack of facilities is another aspect of their menstrual experience. So back home, the only option for them that is available is pads or clothes, and many women cannot afford it, so they sort of like get around with the situation by using pads at school and then clothes at home. But in many cases, even purchasing pads becomes like a hassle and like a huge a difficult experience, because it doesn't work like in the US where you can just go to a convenience store and pick it up, but rather they have to call the shopkeeper to open the shop for them and then ask someone to get it for you. And usually it's a man, so that especially for young girls, it becomes really difficult and they feel like embarrassment and shame in purchasing pads. And then with people who use clothes, there's always like stigma of like not being able to like wash their clothes like openly, and having to find time to wash it secretly and everything. And lack of waste management facilities, and just like sanitation and wash facilities at schools or workplaces or public places, another like big problem, which leads to like women not being able to change their pads or not being able to use the bathroom for the whole day sometimes, which leads to really like crucial health issues as well. But migrating to the US, like they feel much more independent in like and freedom in choosing the products that they want, that they that works best for their body, and also not being able to ask someone to get it for you or like buy it from a man, and just having running water system like all the time, and having access to like public toilets and clean toilets is like another thing that makes their experience with menstruation much more comfortable and normal. I think so. But when they go back home, they still feel they are still impacted by the taboos and myths. They still feel it, they still see it, and then there's still like not proper toilets or proper wash facilities and waste management system back home, so they are still affected by it. But the mental and the inner change that has happened to them by coming to the US still goes like is with them everywhere, so they don't feel shy anymore to like, or embarrassed anymore to like buy pads from a man, or like the idea of impurity from the religious beliefs or social construct of women not being able, like women being lower than men, doesn't affect their self-esteem anymore as a woman. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Angmo. Next up is Grace.
Okay, so my thesis is on the epidemic of school shootings in the United States, and both, it's kind of twofold, both the shootings themselves and like this, why is gun violence in schools such a prevalent pattern in this country, but also its role in American narratives and the American imagination more broadly. And I kind of wanted to look at how this has become something that's expected, something that's normal. And I began kind of counterintuitively by looking into the responses that schools generally have to school shootings, not necessarily at their school, but just in general. So I saw that most schools turn to things like heavy policing, strict security measures, zero tolerance policies, kind of more of a disciplinary stance on rule breaking. So I was looking at statistics on cops on schools. by 2017, more than 40% of schools had armed police officers on campus, compared to 19% in 1999. And a lot of these schools also have, things like security cameras, metal detectors, routine locker searches, and a lot of what I was looking at was the connection between these security measures and the school to prison pipeline. And I found that schools that have, harsher discipline policies and police-based discipline are generally schools that have a higher population of non-white students, even though almost all of the perpetrators of school shootings in the United States in the past 20 years have been white. And so I was kind of looking at how the violence of white youth inadvertently pushes Black and brown students into the criminal justice system, by, having the police state take over education and having education be subsumed into police discipline. So I wanted to kind of map out the advent of this epidemic, and most of the scholars that I was looking at identified the 1999 Columbine shooting as the beginning of it. And it kind of marked this shift in narrative, kind of was the creation of the trope of the mass shooter. I got to talk to one of the authors that I cited very heavily, Rachel Monroe, and we had a long discussion about kind of this racialized double standard between violence of young white men and violence of young Black men. She was basically saying that the trope of the school shooter is very calculated, and there's an emphasis on, like, intelligence and planning and emotionlessness, whereas something like the trope of the super predator is seen as animalistic evil that can't be reformed, that can't be redeemed. And yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And I was looking into a lot of kind of the online, like the rise of internet culture in tandem with the rise of the prevalence of school gun violence. So a lot of that was looking at, like, the kind of niche subcultures that have surrounded the more famous, if you want to say that, mass shooters. So looking into things like true crime, as well as the rise of the online alt-right and the the kind of overlap between that and a lot of the perpetrators. And I found this really interesting dichotomy where so many of these of the people carrying out these mass shootings were preaching philosophies of social Darwinism and of, this natural selection, survival of the fittest mindset. That's something that came up a lot, which Franco Berardi, one of the theorists that I was drawing heavily from, talks about how that is kind of this embodiment of neoliberal capitalism and, this kind of the insatiability of it and the need to win, and how that individualism is juxtaposed with a need for belonging and this kind of tradition that's been created around gun violence and, like, the coalescence of online communities of these men who, for some reason or another, feel so alienated and, othered. And I was kind of looking at that through a lens of gender and race. I touched on the race thing a little earlier, but as for gender, I was kind of looking at gun violence as an assertion of masculinity, and also looking at, like, what does American white masculinity look like, and what are those ideals? And a lot of it came back to, like, a culture that is highly militarized, one that values violence in men, and one that is, you know, once again, very just savagely individualistic, and also like a sense of what a few of my sources called aggrieved entitlement, which is basically the sense that you are being deprived of something, and it's kind of it, and it's used a lot in here to talk about why a lot of these mass shooters will target women who've rejected their romantic advances, or people who they perceive have bullied them. So I also wanted to kind of wrap it up by talking about looking into why is this an American phenomenon, and why don't other countries have, like, you know, why don't other countries really have this problem of school shootings, and why are Americans, you know, accustomed to this almost. So I was really fascinated by this idea that the gun control debate has kind of spanned across the political spectrum. I mean, right now you have the NRA being very heavily associated with the far right, but back in the 60s, they were, you know, pushing for a repeal of California's open carry laws in response to the Black Panthers arguing that Black people should have the right to bear arms to protect themselves from police brutality. And on the left, you have, you know, there's a very strong, both pro and anti-gun left. So I don't know, and I just had never really seen a political issue that was as all over the political spectrum as this one. And toward the end, I kind of finished, I'm not sure if I'm going to keep this conclusion, but I was writing about how it kind of feels out of touch to be writing about school shootings during the COVID-19 lockdown. There was this article that came out that announced that March 2020 was the first March since 2002 that we hadn't had any school shootings, and it was because all the schools are closed. And I kind of linked it back to this idea of capitalism in decay, how both of these crises are ones that show the defects of capitalism and the degrading of social relations under it. And just kind of, I don't know, it's weird to be working on this project right now and finishing it right now, just because, yeah, there's the epicenter of it is kind of not in operation, and, you know, we don't know what's going, you know, where the gun control debate and where the gun crisis is going to be at once schools do reopen. So I don't know.
Thanks, Grace. Next up is Jillian.
All right. Language and identity in Appalachia. Oh, and before I begin, my internet connection is really unstable, so if it gets really wonky, please interrupt me because I know it's really annoying to just hear static. So anyway, I focused on language and identity in Appalachia because I'm from Western North Carolina, and my home means a lot to me. If you're not familiar with the Appalachian region, it's generally defined by the Appalachian Mountains, specifically in the South. So West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and then parts of Kentucky are like the primary states in the Appalachian region. So in the past few years, Appalachia has really come under scrutiny again, as it often does. There's a whole host of stigma and negative stereotype against the region. So it was important to me to push against that. So I'm looking at how language style is a component of identity negotiation in Appalachia, and how outside perceptions and contexts affect how people use language style to either mask or present their identity as Appalachians. Scholars report a link between identity and style. So for example, Nicholas Copeland views style and linguistics as a projection of a persona or identity, and we can use style to advance personal or relational goals. So you can present you can present a certain aspect of your identity through your language style. So this fieldwork term, I interviewed 8 people in Appalachia, mainly people from my hometown, but also in the surrounding counties, and asked them about their experiences with language. And essentially what I found is like empirical support of this theory that linguistic style is a projection of identity. So Appalachians are very aware of the negative stereotypes and the general distaste that is harbored for them in the region by the rest of the country. And this absolutely impacts their language use. Almost every participant shared that outsiders had assumed that they were dumb because of their accent, or that they'd heard opinions that talking with a Southern accent makes you stupid or makes you sound stupid. Because of this, they did to being inclined to mask more marked features of their dialect depending on the situation. But despite this, I think this is probably the most important part of my research, despite this stigma, none of them reported any shame about their language, and none of them actually believe that having a Southern accent or an Appalachian accent actually is an indicator of intelligence, especially not lower intelligence. So conversely, many of them also reported that their accents got stronger when they were with family and friends or in other settings where they felt comfortable or familiar. So again, this is kind of more support of linguistic style being a conveyor of identity, because we're seeing, whether it's intentional or not, that people let their identity come through more strongly in a situation or context where they feel that that identity will be respected. In this work, I also detail specific features of Appalachian dialect, as well as certain themes that arose when participants talked about Appalachia and how they define it for themselves. And I wish I had time to get into that. If things were different, I would have liked to have played some excerpts from my interviews so you could actually hear what these people had to say and hear the accent, because it's a really wonderful accent and a really awesome dialect. But basically, like, my findings are significant because in Western North Carolina, we're seeing empirical evidence that supports the theory that language style is a matrix of identity. And furthermore, despite the constant stream of outsiders and outside scholarship kind of dictating how we should feel about being Appalachian or how we should feel about the region itself, Appalachian people really push against that and remain proud of their culture and their speech and their identity. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Jillian. Next up, we have Jade, who I believe is with Katerina.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Jade.
Sorry, I'm sharing the computer with Katya because I couldn't connect somewhat. So my thesis is on the effects of gentrification in Mexico City's Colonia Roma. There are several reasons why I chose this specific neighborhood. The first one is that when I was researching about Mexico City, which to me is a very interesting city, being the largest in population, and if I'm not wrong, in size as well, in all of North America, the Western Hemisphere, and the Spanish-speaking world, is that Colonia Roma was a very significant place, but that was not talked about quite often. It's been portrayed in movies, it's been portrayed in books, but it hasn't really been analyzed as much in scholarship. So I wanted to look at how gentrification had affected that neighborhood specifically, instead of, say, looking at the historical center, which has been, there has been various ethnographies about it. So my fieldwork term research was ethnographic research about the workers and the inhabitants of this neighborhood. And I found first I analyzed the history of the neighborhood and why it was created. And it's it was the first place to be settled outside of the original urban core of Mexico City that had been existing since the 1400s. And it was part of the reason for its existence was that a lot of the upper income residents of the urban core wanted to live in places that allow them to create more spacious houses. And so they moved out to what was once the lake bed of Lake Texcoco, which had been drained by the Spaniards hundreds of years before in order to make arable farmland. And this was actually the first large expansion that has led to the current level of urbanization in Mexico City. And so this happened around the early 1900s. But by the 1970s and 1980s, a series of earthquakes and rising prices, and several economic reforms had led to the neighborhood being inhabited mostly by working class people, which was the case until the mid 2000s and the early 2010s, when the neighborhood underwent a period of very extensive gentrification, in which older businesses were pushed out and the residents had to move to areas much further away from the urban center of the city, to places such as Nezahualcóyotl, which is an hour away, and many of the jobs that had existed in this neighborhood found themselves being replaced by chain stores, much richer businesses, and people found that they had to work in these, they found jobs in these new businesses, which sometimes paid more, but also often led them to have lost their livelihoods, their homes, as a lot of the people who were living there would both own a business and also live in the same place where they would undertake their business. So I discovered that there were several concerns among the participants of the study. What I did is that I had originally planned to do interviews, but mainly because of security concerns, my research slowly changed into being much more focused on participant observations that I would make of the neighborhood and on conversations that I would have on the grounds of anonymity with the participants. And I found that, first of all, there were serious security concerns in the neighborhood, even though since the area has been heavily gentrified, it's seen as a very touristic and safe, quote unquote, place because there are very few visibly poor people. But most of the business owners and the workers there find that they are very much afraid of physical violence and extortion. So the criminal underground that exists in other parts of Mexico City is a real thing in Colonia Roma still. It's just that it's much more it's much less visible. I also found that there were several distinct areas of the city that had been affected differently by gentrification, depending on how close they were to lower income areas, and so that the space that people inhabited was not as desirable. So some of the neighborhoods, streets and houses, businesses still retain a much more similar demographic makeup to 30 years ago than other parts that might be closer to wealthier areas such as Polanco and Condesa. The liberalization of the economy was made much of the changes happen over the last, the changes to the neighborhood's demographic and socioeconomic makeup coincided with the liberalization of the Mexican economy over the 1990s and 1980s. And this led to the entry of a lot of foreign businesses that quickly took root in Mexico City. And interestingly enough, at the same time that at the same time that Mexico City stopped stopped growing at the same rate that it had since the early 1900s to the 1990s, and other cities around Mexico started to grow, was when people had stopped moving to Colonia Roma as much as they had before, lower income people. And so that's around the same time when the process of gentrification started. And also that there's one of the other main concerns that exists for the people who still live and work in this neighborhood, especially even for the people who have to commute hours, is that there's a significant danger in the infrastructure because of the series of earthquakes that have happened in the neighborhood and that have caused significant damage to buildings. And as such, a lot of people are afraid that if there was another significant natural disaster, that the economy of the area would be tanked once again, and more people would lose their jobs, something as devastating as what happened in Mexico City in the 1980s. And the businesses that still survive from that time period mostly focus on serving the workers that work in hospitals, the restaurants, and what the people will often tell you is that, well, if this food stand or this store that has been here since 30, 40 years ago wasn't here, we wouldn't have a place to eat lunch. So those are my findings, and yeah, this is my thesis.
Great, thanks so much, Jade. Next, sliding over to Ekaterina.
Hello. So my work is on Russian economic planning and sustainable development through the lens of sustainable development goals. And sustainable development is a rather ambiguous concept, but there are three main pillars of sustainable development which are largely agreed on by researchers. And these are social equity, environmental protection, and economic growth. And the idea of preserving the resources for future generations, maintaining the balance between the environment and the economy while engaging in the social, economic, and environmental aspects is what precisely distinguishes this concept of sustainable development from environmental policy. And for my research, I chose to study sustainable development through the framework of SDGs, which are Sustainable Development Goals. And I chose it because every goal consists of multiple targets and indicators. And for that structure, the SDGs are globally acknowledged. And also due to its holistic approach to social, economic, and environmental spheres, establish interconnectedness between all the goals and laid out indicators, various follow-up mechanisms, and the endorsement by the international community. SDGs are just widely used tools to monitor and ensure the sustainable development. And what I've done in my work, I firstly done an overview of how Russia deals with the SDGs. And it has been particularly interesting to me because Russia is submitting the report this summer for the way they dealt with SDGs. It's a voluntary report to the UN. I don't know whether they would still submit it because of Corona, but they are supposed to. And what I've discovered in my research is that unlike other countries, Russia doesn't have any laws or decrees or anything regulating SDGs progress, even though Russia says that they are following the SDGs agenda, but they don't use pretty much anything to monitor it. And then what I did, I picked up 5 SDGs, which are specific SDGs which are related to mostly economic development. And I looked through various Russian econ development laws and strategies, and I tried to match it with those SDGs because there are so many similarities and overlap, to see like what's up in Russia. So I looked at that, and I tried to look at several things, and there have been several statements that arose from my research. And one of the first statement, and I backed all of them by data, is that Russian economy is still predominantly based on natural resources rather than on manufacturing. And the money that like the most of Russian money come from oil, gas, and other raw materials. And so the economy depends on extraction of non-renewable resources, but on the other hand, the non-renewable resources bring the extraction of these resources bring the resource extinction. And this becomes a problem specifically with SDGs, since extracting fossil fuels generates lots of negative externalities in terms of pollution and things like that. And so I've been also looking at that, and I've been looking how following SDG framework, there has to be compromise between some of the goals. If you pursue some goals of economic growth and you extract more of the natural resources, you compromise on goals which are more related to environmental protection. And then I provide various recommendations for Russia. And my research is significant since in Russia, the papers on sustainable development are incredibly limited. And there are not that many studies done on SDGs, since it's relatively new concept. And also since Russia has been increasingly trying to gain more international trust and been pushing the agenda that they follow the sustainable development and follow Paris Agreement and other stuff, but they don't. So I dived into that, and that was really interesting. And yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ekaterina, and thank you, everybody. Give yourselves all a big hand. I look forward to reading your final products. Most of you have handed them in. I'm looking forward to receiving those last couple. And as I mentioned before, we will have a celebration next week following the toast at the library. So once again, congratulations to everybody, and see you all soon.